Record. Good morning, dear friends. Thank you for joining us on this Tuesday, the 10th of Teves, Shabbat Teves, a fast day, the 14th of December. And we're here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. At this moment, we are studying Masechet Shabbat, chapter 10, 93b. We are at the tail end of a Mishnah that talks about the crime, how do we say this? A crime that's done in a partnership. Particularly, we're talking, of course, about a bein adam lamakom, between man and God, breaking Shabbos in a partnership. And we were introduced several days ago, to the curious possibility that a desecration of Shabbos in a partnership may leave a person with a lessened degree of culpability, with a lesser degree of liability for desecrating Shabbos, because of the fact that it was done in a partnership. Without rehashing the entire discussion, suffice it to say there are varying shitot. There is a deya, a Mishnaic opinion, I think it was quoted in the Brisa, that says that one would always be liable, even if it is in a desecration of Shabbos is done in a partnership. There's another opinion, was it Rabbi Meir, who says that you're always off the hook. One would never be chayiv biblically for a malacha that's done jointly, even if each partner was necessary. But then we have the middle of the road presentation, which seems to be the preferred viewpoint of the Mishnah, which is if each partner can do it on their own, like we talked about the loaf of bread in the Mishnah, and they do it in a joint fashion, then they would indeed be off the hook. But if each partner was necessary, then both, in order to move the object, then they would both be chayiv. Leading us to one last scenario, which is, what if one guy is able and one partner in the crime is not able? What is then the halacha? And we established that one of the people would be liable. Rav Chisda strongly asserts that the one that would be liable is the individual who has the capacity to actually carry it. And we kind of reject, I don't want to say we reject the personhood of the weaker carrier, because that's not true, but we do reject, or we do not see their nominal assistance as something of substance to make them chayiv. So just to remind you, in a sense, we're being kind, if you will, to the weaker partner by not making them liable, by not considering what they've done to be substantive. Yes, Roberto.
So are we to assume this principle holds for all things during Shabbat, not just carrying?
Indeed. That's what our Gemara conveyed to us, that this could extend beyond only carrying to other malaches as well. Remember, we talked about jointly holding a quill or doing some kind of weaving situation. And Roberto, your question is a good one, because today we're going to see for the final time today, because then we're going to move on to the next Mishnah. We're going to see indeed other instances where a joint partnership of sin, a partner in an Aveira could, how that might work. Just before we go there, again, we're talking about a person whose help is not needed per se, but they do help. How do we view that assistance? And we've established, Rav Chisda says, Misayeya ein boy mamosh, a nominal help that's not substantive, is not considered something of significance. And yesterday's Gemara debated, is that a true statement? Is it a true halachic statement or not? And we introduced a variety of topics, but primarily the notion of the conveyance of the ritual impurity of a zav. A zav can convey ritual impurity by sitting or laying or being supported by something, even if there's no direct contact. But the important restricting or limiting principle is that it has to be supporting the bulk of the zav's weight. And so we talked about a bed with 4 legs, and each leg on its own might be said to have an insignificant role in supporting the Zav, but conversely, we did say that because a bed will not stand without any of the four legs, so in that case, all of the legs are considered equally involved in bearing the weight of the Zav, and therefore they do convey ritual impurity. Where there is something a little more, once again, Dr. Hammer just where it's a little more complicated is by livestock or other situations where the animal can hold itself up on three legs. And so then the question is, what happens with the fourth leg? Dr. Hammer?
Quick question. Maybe I missed it yesterday or today. Is there a limit to the number of people in this quote partnership?
To what purpose? Just if you don't mind explaining.
For being responsible for, in other words, it's carrying. Okay, so now you talk two people. What if there are six people?
I hear what you're saying.
What if 10 people made the decision and hired somebody to do it, knowing whatever?
Interesting. So it's interesting that you say about hiring. I want to avoid talking about it in the moment, just because shlichut l'dvar avera is another question. Can there be? But I want to acknowledge it's a good point. Can there be agency? Can a person do a sin in the representation of another? It's another topic. Generally, the answer is no. But you're asking an interesting question. Here's what I understand your question to be. One person carries something they've carried. Two people carry. One person's bearing the bulk of the weight, and the other person is just tagging along. So the person that carried. The person that's tagging along has not. But I think what you're saying is, okay, now you have a beam. And what if you have six kids who are each incapable? Or I don't mean kids. Six people that are not very mighty. And so each of them on their own do not contribute significantly. But, so now here's my question. So is there also a strong person involved? Or are we saying, are there just six people distributing the weight? Collectively, they're able to carry it?
We're in the shul and there's a dining room table, not the normal fold up, wooden dining room tables. And you say, hey, guys, help me. So three other guys take a corner. You're at the fourth corner, and we move it outside across the street to,
That's a very good question, because here I believe what you're saying. I'll tell you why. I mean, it's a good question because if I understand your scenario now correctly, each person is essential. Each person is actually making it happen. So to the adeya, to the ashita that says that if two people are absolutely necessary, which seems to be the primary day of our Mishnah, you're chayiv. Well, then presumably that same principle would extend to more partners. I believe that would be the case, but I'd feel most comfortable if I could give you a citation from the Mishnah or the Tosefta or the Gemara. So let's keep it with let's keep an eye out to see if we'll have any clues. But that's a very good question. I would be surprised. We'll at the end of this segment, we'll take a look at the Rambam and let's see if he explicitly mentions your question, because it's a good one.
Just a quick comment that I was thinking. I don't want an answer. I was thinking of Shnaima Ochsam Batalis, if whether that issue ever came up in that regard, because it's the same issue. Okay.
Yeah, interesting. All right, so but that is more or less the introduction. We're in the tail end of this discussion about joint partnership and particularly about Misayeya Ein by Mamash. Yesterday we talked mostly about the Zav. I gave you the outside, but if you remember, my cursor was acting up and we just ended 3 minutes earlier, or whatever it was. The next question is going to be a kohen who needs to have his feet firmly planted on the floor of the Beis Hamikdash. If there's something in the way, is it considered a hefsek or not? Let's take a look inside and let's explore that text. Here we go. And just to point out again, we are 93b. Let me see if I can exit that. Here we are. Okay. Just going to hit mute all. There's some clanging of dishes in the background. Please unmute to interject, to be involved in the conversation. Hey, okay. All right, I hope no one's getting dizzy. We're almost there. There we go. Yeah.
In case of emergencies, could you do that? Could you get six people to move it? I'll give you an example. we're in shul, and you're on the bima, and somebody's reading somebody's leaning,
Okay.
and you get a drip of water that comes very close from the TV, comes very close to the Torah, to the Torah scroll. Are you allowed
Okay.
to push that whole thing away?
Well, you're not. You're in a shul, so you're within an area that you're in a rishus hayachid, where you're entirely permitted to carry. But you're asking, can we ever employ this joint carrying as a leniency to attempt to carry? Good question. Let's leave it unanswered at the moment, but it's a good question.
Okay.
Rabbi Lazar Oimer. The Shulchan. You see, I can't resist. The Shulchan Aruch, I believe, does talk about under certain acute circumstances using this, well, something similar. Anyways, so not exactly joint carrying, but similar ideas. Tat Rabbi Eli Afanan Nami Tenena. We also have another Mishnaic source as the Gemara. It sounds like it's in the middle of a sentence, but we're talking about Misayeya in Baimamish, that helping. If you're practically in the way, we're not going to consider that part of the process. Where do we see that? Rabbi Lazar taught as follows. Ragloi echad ala kli. Ragloi echad al haritzpa. If a kohen is standing with 1 foot on a vessel of sorts, and 1 foot is on the floor, or ragloi achas al ha'even, 1 foot on a stone, ragloi achas al haritzpa, another foot is on the ground. So what's the problem? Let's see Rashi. Because Rashi adds words that are missing from our text. Koyin ha'omed. If you have a koyin standing, al gabe kli oy even oy shum davar hachoytzeitz. A koyin is standing on a vessel or a stone or really anything that separates beinoy lebein haritzpa, between his feet and the ground. Alan, you and I have to listen carefully to this. Ve'avad avaydasai, and he served in the Beis Hamikdash. He did whatever temple service. Pisula, the act that he did is disqualified. It is not a kosher temple service. How? Why? Because it talks about the service of the Kohen, the Levi, serving together. They have to all stand in the same manner, meaning barefoot, feet planted on the floor. Tana de Rabbi Shmuel teaches Hoyel. Basically, the Gemara has an elaborate series of limudim that infer that it is halachically necessary for a kohen to have the direct contact between their feet and the ground. What's relevant, for our Gemara is not the specifics of the process of inferring that your feet have to be on the ground, but is there such a thing as a misayeya? Is there such a thing as something bearing your weight that is or is not significant?
Rabbi,
Reb Beryl, yes.
aren't we punishing the wrong people? If the coin is there,
There's no punishing. Hold on, there's no punishing at all. It has to be done right.
I'll tell you what's bothering me. He's dichening, he's blessing the oilam, and if he's improper, it affects the blessing on the people.
Well, we're not talking about duchening. We're talking about much bigger issues.
No, that's just where I'm coming from. I don't know. Maybe I'm off base.
Beryl, so you don't get blessed.
But Beryl, I want to tell you, you're actually onto something. An interesting question. In the Chabad, one of the Chabad traditions is to study the work of the Rambam, Mishnah Torah, 3 chapters a day, which I endeavor to do. And recently, we are talking about different areas of karbanos and the power of a kohen to have a bad machshava, to have an inaccurate machshava, a thought. Dr. Hammer, you would love this, or maybe not, depending on. But this is actually a very, very powerful machshava subject, where the kohen having a bad intent, not like to murder somebody, but just to eat the carbon that they're offering past the deadline, or to sprinkle the blood outside of the temple compound, or other such things, could disqualify the carbon. Now, right. So Roberto, this is, I think, what you're getting at. And so exactly. I was swatting away what you said, but you're really onto something very good general question, which is, why are we giving Alan, myself, so much power. And when we do mess things up, we're not being punished. The owner, which is either the kahal or a yachid, an individual who would have their carbon disqualified, they are the victim. It's a good question. So I don't want to answer, but I just want to explain that you're making a good point. Suffice it to say here, we're not talking about victims. There are no aggrieved parties. We are verifying the halacha. A kohen goes into his app. I'm into this kohen app. Okay, but anyways, the kohen realizes that he brought a carbon and his one foot was on top of, he had his foot on top of something else. So now he needs to go find out, was his carbon disqualified or not? So here is the teaching. Royin, let's take we take a look. We assess. Kol she'ilu yinotel hakli. In a scenario where the kli would be removed, or vitinotel ha'even, or the stone is removed, yachol lamed al raglei achas, if he'd be able to maintain his balance and still be standing on one foot, avoidasik sheira, his avoida is still kosher. V'imlav, but in the absence of that vessel, he would topple over, meaning it was bearing a significant amount of his balance. Avoidasai psula, then his avoida is on kosher. What does this have to do with our topic?
It's
V'amai,
a strong partner or a weak partner.
Oh, so the Gemara says, V'amai, why do we say that if we could remove the keli or the stone, it's as if he stood on the ground, the stone is still helping maintain his balance. Lav, mishum damrinan, you must concede it's because of an important principle, misayeya ein by mamash. Support, not so interesting. Support is in assistance, that's not substantive, is not substantial. Ravina then chimes in and says, indeed, Afanan Nami Tonena, we also have another Mishnah that can infer this very similar idea, also about a kohen. Alan, you see, it's not a surprise that you're more in tune to matters of agriculture and zoology, because you're a kohen, and kohenim have to deal with these things. So, but there are parts of the kahuna that are a little more bloody and gory. So bear with us for a moment. As we know, part of the...
What I don't understand is we've been studying all areas of what you can't do and what you should do and measurements and everything else, but they're not giving you the measurement of a stone. What if you of a stone?
Because the size of the stone is not so interesting.
But the coins walk around. The coins walk around the base of Mikdash barefooted, don't they?
Correct. Because here the principle is not the size of the stone. It's a question, Mr. Kohen, was your balance? Would you have maintained your balance in the absence of that stone? If your foot would not have been there, would you still be able to stand or not? So the size doesn't matter. There is a specific metric that's not about shiur. It's about balance. And so for that reason, it would be superfluous to mention a shiur because that's not what's relevant here.
Yes, Normie.
So you're
hang on. Yeah.
So for me, it could be a little pebble, and for you, it could be a larger stone,
or vice versa.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Exactly.
So it's just a matter of balance.
Yeah.
The stone doesn't mean much.
Could I, Rabbi?
We have two doctors in the queue. I think Dr. Hammer, go ahead.
Quick question on the last Rashi. You suggested that also Levium had to go without shoes, without touching the ground.
That wasn't fair for me to zip past that. But yeah, the pasuk that we're quoting references Levium, Echav HaLeviim. Apparently so.
Apparently so.
Apparently so.
So I wasn't aware of that. And the other thing is, when Beryl talked about duchening, let's assume it's equivalent somehow. Why are socks acceptable as being the same as being barefoot? You're not barefoot when you're wearing socks. And in those days, sandals were often made out of material, not just leather. So whatever. Okay.
So interestingly
Well,
enough,
that was going to be part of my question. What constitutes chatzitza?
Right.
good
Thank
question. Okay, so let's back up for a moment. There are two different halachot. There's the halacha of a kohen or apparently a Levi in the Beis Hamikdash being barefoot. In order to be activated, you have to be touching the ground. There's a chatzitza, which is anything that is blocking substantially between your foot and the floor, a shoe, a sock, a piece of wood or stone or whatever. That's considered a chatzitza. And for temple services, that's unkosher. Now, I believe, and I may be wrong, but I believe there's a separate issue that has to do with duchening. And the issue that has to do with duchening is distinct because it was a separate takana. The takana was that people would trip because they used to have sandals that were somewhat susceptible to breaking. And a kohen would end up not making it up to the front, and people would say, oh, he was probably disqualified from the kahuna. And so a takana was established long ago that the kohen should duchen without their footwear on. However, I don't believe that takana is the very same, so is identical to the idea of being barefoot in the Beis Hamikdash. Otherwise, the shul would even be a whole lot smellier when it came to birchas kohanim. But I believe that's why we're not replicating the barefoot.
Isn't it
Go
something to
ahead.
do with leather?
Hold on,
Like
Dr. Hammer. Hold on.
No, just a quick insight. You had Reb Menachem, you had me waiting to ask questions. It's very clear that he got to the Ikar because he gets paid by the procedure. I get paid by the hour, so I take my time in asking questions.
That's a very interesting study on that. So Reb Menachem, generally speaking, chatzitza is really anything that interrupts. But I have to reread up on the specific halachas of chatzitza as it pertains to a kohen or a Levi in the Beis Hamikdash. But generally speaking, there needs to be direct exposure of the kohen or Levi's foot to the ground. It's interesting because I think today we have. I'm thinking more to like long back to like bumper cars. Have you ever seen those bumper cars that have those posts that go up to the ceiling, and it appears that they're getting their electricity from the ceiling? So I'm envisioning, right, or other kinds of. So I'm envisioning where we can imagine that there's a certain kind of electric activation by being in a direct contact with the surface, which if it is interrupted, there's a spiritual distance between the kohen or the Levi Hasharis and the Kiddusha. So that's just something that I'm envisioning. But anyways. So the Gemara asserts...
We have to end up being able to blame the Levi for something.
Oh,
yeah.
We get our percentage. That's all.
The Levi put the stone there.
Doctor, actually, I should have sent her. I saw something interesting. Someone sent me a meme. I don't know where it is. Hold on. So yeah, they would never let me work for the Secret Service. There was a meme about, Mazel Tov, they discovered their Levi. Oh, so what? So what does that mean? You could live in a city of murderers because right, the Ari Miklat were Levite cities, and you could wash the Cohen's hands, and you get your Aliyah second. And I have to find it and send it to you. All right. So lastly, on the topic of Misayeya in Beimamash, another halacha. Ki bel b'yamin. Oh, so this is where we were going at. So a kohen in the karbonis, they would accept a certain amount of the blood would be received in a keli, in a vessel, and that blood would be poured on the mizbeach at different locations in different ways. How there were highly choreographed and highly regulated methods for receiving the blood. How do you have to receive the blood? In your right hand. So you have to be holding the keli in your right hand. So here's the question. Ki bel b'yamin. If the individual is holding the keli, the vessel, in his right hand to collect the blood of the carbon, who's small misayate, but his left hand is also helping out. Avaidas like sheira, the avodah is yet kosher. Why is it a kosher avodah? The left hand is involved in a support capacity in this moment. Surely here too we'll explain the assistance that is done by the left hand is inconsequential. He's holding it with his right hand. Shma mina, and indeed, this is a third proof that Misayeya in by mamash. That the halacha is Misayeya in by mamash.
Rabbi,
Yes.
just a thought. I find it amazing that all this is so many years after the Churban, the level of detail that was available to the rabbis of the services in the Beis Hamikdash. I'm amazed.
Yeah. It's actually an interesting point to consider. Very interesting.
We've had the issue of handedness before in several issues.
Yes.
And we all often there was some recognition that not everybody is right-handed.
Right. Well, some of my best friends are left-handed. Some of my dearest Talmud friends are left-handed. Interestingly enough, right over here in this very moment, the issue doesn't quite seem to be directly about right-handedness versus left-handedness. Although it certainly touches upon it. The issue here seems to be which hand holds the keli. But Doctor, you're correct that a person who is left-handed is more likely to hold the vessel primarily in their left hand. See, my sound just cut out, I think. Someone say something.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay,
We hear you.
okay, here.
Yeah, I don't think anybody can hear me though.
I hear you.
Oh.
But indirectly, yes, that certainly is an issue. It's an interesting shaila. I don't want to go into now. In general, it seems like there was a certain in royalty, there was a certain choreographed manner of doing certain things. I mean, I guess kind of the way, if you any kind of military formation or whatever, very highly choreographed, And so the idea, at least I think the way the Rambam would probably explain it in the Moreh Nevuchim, is that there has to be a highly choreographed and precise method of operation. And so therefore, all the Kohanim across the whole temple were all accepting in one method and pouring in one method and dressed in one way. And so there is something somewhat, there is a consideration for the visual dynamic and the perception of what's happening. But anyways, that's the halacha, and from here we can extract and infer Misayeya in by mamash. Just to take a fast glance into the Rambam, there was always a preference to do the avodah in the right hand. A kohen who does the avodah with his left hand, the avodah is disqualified. Then he says, "Raglei achas al kli, raglei achas al ritzpah." To our issue that we just talked about previously, if one foot is on something else and one foot is on the floor, right? I haven't precisely the formula of our Gemara. We take a look and see if we removed, would he still have his balance? Avodas kshera, imlav avodas psal. Kibel b'yamin usmol, misayatay, avodas kshera, shamisayya ein mashkichin olav. Interesting, the Rambam uses slightly different words to express the same idea. Shamisayya, this assistance of the left hand, ein mashkichin olav, that's not enough to mess things up. So interesting to see how the Rambam discusses it.
So, Rabbi, this would further suggest that the Levi who is doing the washing would have to do it with his right hand as well.
Interesting question. Interesting. So I'll tell you the interesting thing. When it comes in general to many parts of halacha, there is also a priority to use the right hand. However, when it comes to those matters, typically a left-handed person would do those very acts with a yamin shaloi, their dominant hand, which is the left hand. So again, I'm less qualified to talk about left-handed nisan halacha than some of the members of our chabura. But so therefore, many people, let's say a right-handed person would wash their right hand first, but a left-handed person would wash their left hand first. And similar with other such issues, we talked about tying shoes, maybe, or putting on tefillin. So that is that. Now, let's continue. Just want to make sure I didn't go too far. I did, okay. Here we go. Okay. Now we're going to go back to another part of the joint melacha. Amar mar, ze yachol v'ze yachol. If both individuals are capable to carry the item on their own or to do the act, the melacha on their own. So the first opinion of the Mishnah, excuse me, says that you are potter. Right, that's the case of the kikar. They both are, and so therefore you're off the hook. But Rabbi Meir says you are chayiv. Rabbi Meir says one is yet chayiv, even though they could each do it on their own. They are still chayiv. But here's an interesting question, according to Rabbi Meir. But inon shir lazeh v'shir lazeh. So we know they're both capable of doing it on their own. But in the commission of melacha, does there need to be a shear for each individual? What do we mean shear? Rashi. For example, as we discussed at length, there's a minimum shear for carrying something. Right? If something is too small, it's not considered carried. It's considered nothing at all. We spent a long time on it. Now, if two people are carrying something jointly, does it have to have a double shear? So, for example, for carrying food, it has to be the size of a dried fig. Does this item need to be at the very least the size of 2 dried figs? Or is one shear enough to make both of them culpable for carrying on Shabbos? Again, be'inan shear lazeh v'shir lazeh, ideal mashir echad l'kulam. Size of 1 dried fig or 2 dried figs, or whatever the specific item was. And there's actually, believe it or not, a machlokes. Rav Chisda and Rav Hamnuna both have a different take on the opinion of Rabbi Meir. One of these two rabbis say there needs to be a measure for each of the carrying individuals. So, Dr. Hammer, here's where your question gets interesting again. In that case, according to Rabbi Meir, if there are 6 people, does it need to be 6 shiurim? The other opinion says no, one measure is sufficient for all. So Rav Papa is going to quote Rava to try to give an opinion here. We have a Mishnah that can give us proof. What's the Mishnah? So let's take a look. This is going to be somewhat familiar. A zav on a bed, and under the bed there are 4 legs, and the 4 legs are each on top of a garment. Each one is because each of the legs are necessary, and therefore everything that's under the legs is bearing the weight of the leg, which is bearing the complete weight of the individual who is impure. The Gemara asks, should we be taking into account that there should be a zav for each post? If we're distributing, if the carrying is being distributed, then maybe there needs to be times 4 of individuals or weight. And the Gemara answers, but I don't even get too far into this. There's lav mishum damrin and shir echad l'kulam. Obviously, what we mean to this can teach us that one measure is satisfactory to be liable for multiple parties, multiple individuals. Rashi says there should have to be 4 zavim, so that each leg is fully bearing the weight of an individual zav. And ultimately, that's not the case. And so from here, Rav Papa wants to infer that 1 grogeres, 1 measure is enough even for multiple individuals. And again, it is interesting, as the professor pointed out yesterday, it's interesting to analogize between individuals and, let's say, bedposts or the distribution of weight. But halachically, for this concept, the Gemara is not afraid to do so. But have no fear. We're going to move on to other instances that will also prove the same point regarding one shear for multiple individuals. Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, "Afanan namitanena." We can also find a Mishnah, or we can find a Mishnaic source. What would be the source? Tzvi shenichnas labayis, and this is where it gets interesting. You're not allowed to trap on Shabbos. Anything, animals. Well, so what happens if you don't intend to trap? The animal traps itself. If a deer enters your home, and one person locks the door. So the person that locked the door is chayiv. Why? Chayiv. Rashi. Zu hi tzeidase. A wild animal, an open door is not trapped. When you lock the door, that's the moment the animal becomes trapped. On Shabbos, one oughtn't to trap, and therefore one would be chayiv. What if na'alu shnayim? What if two individuals lock the door together? They do the act, they do the malacha jointly. Pturim, they are potter. They're exempt. Why? Rashi reminds us, Rabbi Yehuda, who the potter b'shnei yochelim, just to realize that this teaching is consistent with Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says if each one could do an act individually and they do it jointly, they're potter.
Rabbi,
Hold on. What if one guy is unable to get the lock on? And then two did it jointly? Oh, chayavim. They are chayiv.
No.
Here they did a malacha jointly. The malacha was they locked the door together in an act of trapping. So they are chayiv.
Maybe outside still?
So what do we see here? Two people do a malacha together. And although there's only a single shear, a single animal, they're both chayiv. Interesting. The Gemara says, there should be the minimum shiur. A trapping needs a creature. So two people should need two creatures. So, except two individuals can commit a joint malacha even if there's only a single shear. Anyone want to discuss? It's an interesting analogy.
You have a deer in your house. I think you have some other things to consider before you worry about trapping on Shabbos.
That's true. As a matter of fact, apparently deer is one of the highest causes of traffic.
It's a kosher animal.
Collisions.
It's a kosher animal. You could save it and eat it.
A deer in your house is probably worse than a bull in a china closet.
I better not call my wife a deer anymore.
So the problem is if you have a dog or a cat and you close your door,
that's an interesting shaila, because if they're domesticated and they come in and go without, it's a different question. Did I tell you about the time I caught a friend's pet? Anyways, okay, we'll tell you another time.
I wanted to ask you a question, Rabbi.
Go ahead.
In Montreal, especially during the time of Sukkot, we get the table is full of honey, of course, and lots of good food, and we get swarms of bees that come in, and the kids usually take a plastic glass and they trap the bee. Are we allowed to do that?
Probably should not do that. Probably should.
You need to put a trap
rather than get stung.
Well, I think they have traps. I think they have kind of traps that you don't have to do anything, that you could set up before Shabbos. And
yeah, they have. I used to have.
Speak to your competent local Orthodox rabbi, but certainly to trap them be a dime.
Put them on the outside, and they attract the bees, and they get caught inside, and they just leave your sukkah alone. Yeah, they do work.
So suffice it, but yeah.
If I could go back to the left-handed, I remember the professor telling us that they had a tradition in Russia or whatever. If they saw a child was left-handed, they would train him to become right-handed.
Yeah.
Halachically, what would we consider that?
Either he would be considered right-handed, or he would be considered halachically a halachic mess.
They did that in
No, I think that what the question is that they didn't just train. They would tie the left hand during the dinner time so that the child is forced to use the right one. It was the question of persuasion. It was indeed a question of trapping.
And that child would become
Not in
right-handed,
the
Professor?
biblical sense.
Those children became right-handed eventually?
Yes.
They became oriented to operate in a right-handed manner.
That was the case with my wife, and she does most of the everyday things with the right hand. But when it comes to precision work, like handling a needle or something like that, she uses the left one. But the trapping did result in her using right hand predominantly.
Interesting.
I believe, if my memory is correct, that in America this was done also
Yes.
before the 19th century consistently. In the 18th,
Even
yeah.
earlier, it was done to my uncle who was born like in the late 20s. He was being forced to become a righty. And of course, a lot of psychological problems go with it, unfortunately.
What, with being compelled to
Being forced to use the opposite hand. I know he had issues in later life. Yeah.
I remember that when I started teaching here in this country at the early 80s, I was stunned how many students were writing with left hands. There was nothing like that in Russia, not nearly. And for me, it was very strange sight.
interesting.
There was something about left in Russia that's a whole other story.
It's a different story, yes.
So, but going back to the trapping for a moment, what we see over here, and we hope to extrapolate to the rest of the laws of Shabbos and beyond, is that one shiur, to trap something, you need to have a creature. That's one count of trapping. To trap two animals would be 2 counts of trapping. So do you need to have 2 counts for 2 individuals, or can there be a joint culpability? And the answer, of course, that the Gemara infers here is shiur echad lekulam, 2 people could be culpable for a single count of trapping. Amar Ravina, afanana mitanena. To me, this is very interesting. Ravina chimes in and says, indeed, we find in other areas of halacha as well that 2 people could be culpable for a single act. Where do we see that? 2 partners steal something, not something, a creature, an animal. V'tavchu, and they slaughter it. Chayavim, they are liable. So what is the halacha? The halacha is that if you steal someone's livestock and then slaughter it, there is a culpability. One is chayiv not just to remunerate, to compensate the victim, but you actually have to give 4 or 5 times, depending on which creature. Chayavim l'shalim, Rashi says, tashlumei dalid vehei, either 4 or 5 times. If it is an ox, 5 times. If it is a sheep, 4 times. Those who study Baba Kama would be familiar with this conversation. The Gemara says, there is not enough shechita to cause them both to be culpable. Obviously, the Gemara concludes that from here too we see that 2 people committing a crime together can be liable, and we don't consider it as if each has not done a complete crime. I find this instance interesting.
So do they split the Dalet Vehei, or does each one of them pay Dalet Vehei?
No, I believe they split it. The initial Havamina, I think, the initial svara is that neither one committed a full act of shechita. because each one did half a shechita. But the reality is that and yet we're saying that they're chayiv. Now, Dr. Hammer, this actually does get a little bit into the question that you asked about partnership to do a sin. So I don't have the exact specifics of what it looked like. I guess they stole it together.
Can you differ? You could differentiate between stealing and slaughtering. You could steal an animal and not slaughter it, or you could.
Then you could return the
that you didn't steal and that was stolen.
Right. So that's really a good question for Baba Kama about the specifics of when one would be able to return the animal without having to be culpable for Daled V'Hei or not, which is a good question. But for the purposes of our Gemara, this is an interesting instance.
Yeah. I mean, it might be worth to become a thief. I mean, the price of meat, good piece of flesh, 4 or 5 times, you know.
Are we
Go to
not
Kosher
worried?
Kingdom, you'll find out, you know, you'll.
Are we not worried which of the partners did most of the work here?
Not in this citation, but again, in Baba Kama, we can go through all of the specifics. Here, we really have one agenda in mind, which is, do you need to have if 2 people do a crime jointly, do they each need to have their own shiur, or will we look at what they've done collectively as a single account? I think that's how we would refer to it in the legal system. And a single behavior, a single crime can be done jointly, and yet we don't say, oh, each one only did half a crime. Again, in the law, it doesn't really, I don't think it works this way so much. But in halacha, there is such a thing as a minimum measure to be guilty for committing a crime. And ultimately, what we're asserting here is that that is not the case. 2 people can jointly be liable, and that is that's that. We'll just do a few more lines and we'll call it a day. Similarly, we can infer the same, that there's no 2 people can share a single crime. If 2 individuals jointly carry a weaver's reed. What's special about a weaver's reed? Apparently, it is a common event that 2 people would carry a single weaver's reed, and apparently it was heavy, so they're chayiv. They're each carrying this item jointly. They should each need to have their own measure. Here too, we can infer that even if they're both jointly carrying only the measure of a single carryable item, you should be chayiv. Let me take that back. Kana shel gardi apparently is a very small piece of reed. He says, maybe this is not a good instance. Maybe the reason why they're both chayiv is because the wood here is enough to cook 2 eggs, and so it has 2 shiurim. Sigmar says, in K, lashmina and kana dalma. Then they should rephrase it, just the word kana. You shouldn't say kana de gardi. Maishna kana de gardi. Obviously, here it's a single shear. Maybe there is satisfactory, whatever, to do 2 different acts of weaving. So the Gemara says, you know what? Let's strike this citation from our attempt to prove that a single shear could make 2 people chayiv. All right, we're going to stop right over here. Tomorrow, with Hashem's help, we'll finish up just the last few lines of this Mishnah and then go on to a new Mishnah. Rabbi Beryl,
Rabbi, just in case we think that this is minutia and no relation to the real world, let me tell you, today in California, if you steal less than $10, they do not charge you. They show thieves with calculators. So now if there's 2 guys and they stole $20 worth of goods, could they come to court and say we each had less than $10? Or we say you guys stole $20?
So
And
I
you
was
can
actually
steal up to
thinking,
950. You can steal up to 950 and it's only a misdemeanor.
Yeah, they showed some guys with calculators.
Yeah, but then they add on the tax in California, and then they put you
Yeah,
away.
that part, no, tax only when you pay.
No.
No, but it shows you, you look at this and you say, it's so ridiculous. Who cares? But, comes to the base, then stuff arises.
yeah.
I know,
Rabbi.
Alan. Are we talking about Canadian or American dollars? I know, Alan.
Rabbi, are you familiar with a kollel that's being started at Boca?
I am not. Baruch Hashem, there's a lot of Jewish growth. So, which
That's-
kollel
I
are you
think-
referring to?
Is that a Boca
I don't
Raton
know the
synagogue?
name. But
sorry?
I know that
That's been going on for quite a while. And they started up again since the pandemic.
they're starting up a kollel, and the Rosh Kollel is going to be Rabbi Yoni Levin.
Oh,
Oh,
beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, so
So he's
they're
leaving
bringing-
He's leaving Eish Kodesh.
No. He's gonna stay at Eish Kodesh. He's coming in on weekdays, Monday to Thursday. He's gonna spend time in Boca, and he's gonna go to Israel also to recruit. And they're paying for everything and all his travels. And he is remaining in Eish just the same. Because they want to keep them and they're willing to share them with Boca.
wow.
Wow. Beautiful. Beautiful. It sounds like a lot of good friend nachas. Is that what we call it?
Yep.
Yeah. You have a friend by the same last name?
Back in the beginning of November, they have an email from them.
Familiar?
What?
I said you know
Just like
somebody
it's
by the same
on
last
November
name?
2nd, I have an email saying they're back in person. They must have been doing it online, and we went back live again because they have this call has been going on for years there. I remember going sometimes when I lived in Boca at the Boca Raton Synagogue. Is that the one?
I'm not sure exactly which one, but I know for the past few years they brought him down a few times to spend the Shabbos, to give some shiurim. They used to come by to shul by Arab label.
Yeah. All right, gentlemen, I got to run. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day. For those that are fasting, an easy fast. I look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. Be'ezer Hashem. Gesundheit and Freiligkeit.
Amen.
Shikoya,
Good. Everybody.
you didn't do your dedications.
You're right, but we sent it in text. Yes, let's daven for refuah shlema for all the names that are in our WhatsApp, and for all the dear members of our Chabura and beyond. And shkoyach.
And for Victor's wife.
Tomorrow. Yeah. All right. Take care. Be well.